You have probably heard this story. Wolves came back to Yellowstone and the rivers changed. It might be the most repeated nature story of the last decade. Bring back the wolves and a broken landscape heals itself all the way down to the shape of the water. So here is the question this entire video is built on. Did wolves really change Yellowstone's rivers the way the popular story says they did? Almost everyone who has heard it believes it. It is clean, it is beautiful, and it feels completely settled. But what if the most famous nature story of the last decade is, at least in part, a myth? Because the scientists who actually go out and measure the willows and the aspen in that park cannot agree on how strong this was, what caused it, or whether the river part survives contact with the data. There is one number at the center of this fight, and an enormous one. A claim that willow growth exploded by around 1500%. Hold on to that number, because other scientists say the way it was calculated is circular. And note something already, I just said willows and aspen, plants. The famous claim is about rivers. Keep your eye on that gap, because it turns out to matter more than almost anything else here. One more thing before we start, because it is the easiest part to get wrong. The scientists raising these objections are not anti-wolf. Nobody in this story is arguing that wolves do not matter. So, 4 questions. Did the rivers really change? What does that giant number actually measure? Is the fight about water or about plants? And if the critics are not wolf haters, what exactly are they objecting to? Stay with me. Start with what actually happened, because that part is not in dispute. For most of the 20th century, there were no wolves in Yellowstone at all. They had been hunted and trapped out under a policy that treated predators as vermin. By the mid-1920s, the gray wolf was gone from the park, functionally absent from around 1914 to 1926. For roughly 70 years, Yellowstone ran without its top predator. Then, in January 1995, that changed. On the 12th of January, the first wolves were brought in through the Roosevelt Arch at the park's north entrance. 14 of them went into holding pens in the Lamar Valley that year, kept penned for about 10 weeks, then released in late March. A second group followed in 1996, and by the end of that year 31 wolves in total had been brought back into the park. After 70 years, Yellowstone had its predator again, and people started watching very closely what happened next. This is part of why the whole case matters so much. Yellowstone had become a rare, real-world natural experiment. Take a top predator out for 70 years, put it back, and watch what the land does. Scientists have been arguing over how to read that experiment ever since. Here is the story that grew out of that, the one you have almost certainly heard. And I want to tell it cleanly and fairly first, the way its supporters tell it, because you cannot see what is contested until you have seen the clean version. And you can feel why it spread. It is the rare ecology story with a hero, a villain, and a happy ending. Pull one thread, and the whole tapestry mends itself. It turns a graph into a fable. That is exactly what makes it so satisfying to repeat, and so easy to overtrust. It goes like this. With wolves gone, elk had multiplied and gotten comfortable. They lingered along the streams and rivers, grazing the young willow and aspen down to nubs, year after year, so those plants never grew tall. Then the wolves came back. They killed some elk, but more importantly, so the story goes, they changed how elk behaved. Elk stopped loitering in the open valleys and exposed riverbanks where they were easy to ambush. Ecologists sometimes call this a landscape of fear, the idea that a predator reshapes a system not only through what it kills, but through where its prey is now too nervous to linger. With the elk moving on, the pressure came off the stream sides. The willow and aspen could finally grow. Shrubs and young trees rose along the banks for the first time in decades. And that, the story says, set off a chain reaction. Taller plants meant deeper roots, and deeper roots stabilized their banks. Stable banks meant less erosion. The returning greenery brought back the beaver, which eats willow and builds with it. Beaver dams pulled the water, spread it out, and created wetland where there had been bare channel. And so, the climax of the whole thing, the rivers themselves changed. They narrowed, deepened, and began to meander differently as the banks held. The claim in one line is that by removing wolves and then restoring them, we had changed the physical shape of the rivers. That is the story. One predator, pulled out and put back, ripples all the way down through elk, plants, beaver, and finally the water itself. Ecologists call this kind of top-down chain a trophic cascade, and it is genuinely one of the most elegant ideas in all of ecology. It is elegant, it is hopeful, and it went absolutely everywhere. The trouble is not that it is elegant. The trouble is what happens when you try to measure it. Because for an idea this big, sooner or later you have to put numbers on it. How much did the plants actually recover? And in 2025, one of the research groups most associated with the strong version of this story put a very big number on the table. In a paper in the journal Global Ecology and Conservation, William Ripple and colleagues, who have argued for a strong Yellowstone cascade for 2 decades, reported that streamside willow had increased dramatically since the wolves returned. This was not a one-off. It sits on top of 20 years of fieldwork from the same camp, arguing that streamside aspen and willow rebounded once the elk stopped grazing them so hard. The headline figure was about a 1500% increase in willow crown volume. Crown volume meaning, roughly, the total leafy bulk of the shrub. They framed it as among the strongest trophic cascades documented anywhere on Earth. A crown volume is a modeled quantity. You record a few simple field measurements and let an equation estimate the rest. Done carefully, that is standard sensible ecology. The whole question the critics raise is whether, in this specific case, the equation was quietly doing the work that the data was supposed to do. Now, 1500% is a staggering number, and this is exactly where you have to slow down and ask the boring essential question: how do you actually measure the volume of thousands of willow shrubs scattered across an enormous national park? You cannot weigh them all, so you measure something easier, mostly height, and then use a formula to convert that height into an estimate of volume. Measure how tall the shrub is, run it through an equation, and out comes a number for its leafy bulk. And that conversion, from height to volume, is where this whole debate catches fire. And think about what a percentage like that actually implies. 1500% is roughly a 16-fold increase. Those shrubs would have to be carrying 16 times the leafy mass they had before. On a stream bank you had personally watched for years, would you trust that your own eyes had missed a change that enormous? That gut check, the critics say, is one the number never really passes. In October 2025, in that same journal, a second group of scientists published a formal comment on that paper. It was led by Daniel McNulty at Utah State, with co-authors including the plant ecologist David Cooper at Colorado State. Their central objection is a subtle one, so let me lay it out carefully. They argued the 1500% figure is circular. Here is what that means. The formula used to turn height into volume was itself built assuming a fixed relationship between height and volume. So when the willows got taller, the model did not independently discover that their volume had exploded. It more or less produced a big volume increase, because that is what the equation was built to do with taller plants. Height was used both to compute the volume and to predict it. Feed taller plants into a height-based volume model, and a giant volume jump falls out almost by construction. They raise other problems too. A willow that has been chewed down by elk for years does not grow in a neat shape, the formula assumes, so applying a clean geometric model to a gnarled, browsed shrub can distort the estimate even further. They flag other issues too. They argue the strong cascade case leans on selectively chosen photo comparisons and that it underplays other forces acting on the elk, including heavy human hunting of elk outside the park boundary, which thinned the herds regardless of what the wolves were doing inside it. They point to comparisons between plots measured years apart that may not be truly matched, and to equilibrium assumptions, treating the system as if it settles into a steady balance inside a system that is anything but settled. David Cooper put the bottom line bluntly. In his reading, once you account for these problems, there is no solid evidence that the return of predators caused a large, system-wide increase in willow growth across the park. But read that carefully because the wording matters. That is the critics' conclusion about the evidence. They leave room for modest, patchy recovery, and they argue the strongest version of the claim is not supported by the way it was measured. And they are not alone in landing on a more modest reading. Other work in the same park, drawing on the same lineage of data, including a long-term study by Hobbs and colleagues in 2024, has reported a relatively weak cascade. Same landscape, same plants, a much smaller effect. Sit with how strange that is for a moment. The same park. Overlapping data. One group calls it among the strongest cascades on Earth, another reads it as weak. When careful people looking at the same evidence land that far apart, it usually means the answer depends heavily on the assumptions you feed in before you start counting. And assumptions are exactly what this fight is about. So does the strong cascade camp simply fold? No, and this part matters. In a related dispute over aspen recovery, researchers in that same camp corrected a large error in the size of their effect, a headline multiplier that had to be cut sharply, and still argued the cascade remains strong and ecologically real. On the willow paper itself, the disagreement with McNulty's group was not resolved. Which means, honestly, this is still an active, unresolved scientific disagreement playing out in the pages of journals right now. And it is worth saying this plainly, a formal comment, a reply, a correction that is the system doing exactly what it is built to do. Slow, argumentative, self-correcting. It just looks nothing like the tidy certainty of the story that went everywhere. And now we can pay off some flag at the very start. Go back and look at what these papers are actually fighting about. Willow crown volume, aspen recovery, plant height, browse pressure. Notice what is almost absent from the technical fight, the reverse, the peer-reviewed argument, the 1500%, the circularity objection. All of it is about plants recovering, not about water physically moving. But a famous version of the story, the one that captured everyone, climaxes with the river's changing shape, and that, the river morphology claim, is the part standing on the shakiest ground of all. To actually show that wolves reshape the river, you would need to isolate the wolves' effect from everything else that moves a river channel, and an enormous amount moves a river channel. There are careful local studies of particular streams that do document real change on the ground. But a handful of recovering reaches is a very different claim from wolves reshaping the rivers of Yellowstone as a whole system. The jump from one to the other is exactly the jump the popular story makes without ever pausing on it. Climate and rainfall shifting over decades, the water table rising or falling, beaver activity coming and going on its own schedule, for its own reasons. Other big grazers too, bison numbers in parts of the park actually rose over this same period, and bison browse streamside plants as well. Add the plain lack of local geology, some banks hold, some collapse, wolves or no wolves. Untangling one predator signal from that whole knot across decades, across a park that size, is genuinely hard. So when someone tells you wolves demonstrably remade Yellowstone's rivers, the honest scientific answer is that this specific tidy claim is not established. So let me tell you where the honest middle actually sits, because it is more interesting than either extreme. Almost nobody serious argues the wolves did nothing. Bringing a top predator back after 70 years clearly did something. Elk numbers and behavior shifted, and in some places, along some streams, the willow and aspen do seem to have come back. The fight is about how much, how widely, and how much of it is really the wolves. Was the recovery park wide or patchy, strong along one creek, absent a valley over? How much credit goes to wolves versus water, climate, beaver, and bison? Those are the genuinely open questions, and patchiness is the crux of it. A cascade that fires strongly along one sheltered creek and fizzles out in the next drainage is a real effect, but it is not the same thing as a park remade from the top down. McNulty, a predator effects in Yellowstone are real but context dependent, and strong claims require strong evidence. That is the argument of someone who thinks wolves matter enough to get the science right. Overselling a fragile version of the story does not actually help wolves, it just leaves the real case exposed the moment somebody checks the math. And there is a real cost to getting this wrong out in public. When a fragile scientific claim gets sold as settled fact, the eventual correction hands ammunition to the people who would rather trust nothing at all. Precision is what keeps the wonder honest here. So let us answer the 4 questions we started with as honestly as the evidence allows. Did wolves really change Yellowstone's rivers the way the popular story says? Probably not in that clean, direct, park-wide way. The river-shaped claim is the least supported link in the entire chain. What does that giant number measure? Willow crown volume, estimated from height, and the critics argue that measurement is circular, which is why a 1500% headline should make you cautious, not certain. Is the fight about water or about plants? Almost entirely about plants. The rivers got the fame, the willows got the scrutiny. And are the critics anti-wolf? They are pro-evidence. The disagreement is about rigor, not about whether wolves belong in Yellowstone. They plainly do. So, did the wolves change the rivers? The most honest answer science can give right now is also the least satisfying one.
Probably.
Partly. In some places. Some cascade happened, its size and its cause are still contested, and the rivers specifically are still on the workbench. Det är att tamina för dessa question kommer att nekezia by jordgud ariraga. Messiak ton alemit as a nagret deal more honest. If you like the version where we actually go and check the beautiful story instead of just repeating it, subscribe and come read along or write up at scienceblog.com. And if you want another one where the truth turns out stranger than the legend, our notebooks are still too radioactive to touch. Same channel, next.